How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin. Today I want to bring along with me to discuss the downside of shooting with Sony. So let's jump right into it. First off, I want to say that obviously I do shoot with Sony. I'm not a brand loyalist. I do like the brand. I just do believe that there are a lot of pros and cons with any brand whatsoever. And today I kind of want to discuss a little bit of the downside of shooting Sony, since it's something that I have had discussions with other people about, and I think it'd be something cool to discuss with you guys here. Now, this is a Sony a7 IV, and I also shoot with a Sony a7S III, and I've owned this a7 III, a7R3, a7R2, and so on and so forth, with even the a6000. One of the things that I've noticed with Sony is that despite of being phenomenal cameras and having really cool specs, the one thing that I think is a downside of it is having that much diversity when it comes down to all these cameras that they have without providing good firmware updates. See, I wholeheartedly believe that most of these cameras can get a nice firmware update where you can get a lot of the stuff, fixed rather than just come out with a whole new camera. And that's something that kind of gets annoying when it comes down to most of these cameras, because they just do it because it'll make them more money. At least that's my assumption. See, Sony has been really great to me with everything for the value that I've put into with using these cameras, and I've done a lot with them, and I really truly still enjoy them. And this is just more like a little bit of a rant of a gripe, and I'm curious to see if you have noticed this as well. I think Sony could do more firmware updates. We don't get them. I honestly don't even remember when there was the last update of this camera or even of my Sony a7S III, and they're really great cameras to this day. They just could use a couple here and there things to be updated through firmware. I know that they did some sort of firmware update for the Sony a7 IV, and then people had some issues, and then people said not to do it, and even Sony, I think, went ahead and told you not to do it, and then they sent the right one out, and it was better, and kind of helped out with minor things here and there. One of the things that I've noticed is most camera companies tend to still do firmware updates for most of their cameras, all the way even to a couple years back of models, which is kind of curious to me to know that what is the approach with Sony and what are they planning to do going forward. I think a lot of these cameras could do a firmware update to give you more availability to use this camera to its fullest potential rather than hinder it to make you want to buy the next one. And as we all know, with today's economy and everything around the world, without getting too deep into the aspect of whose fault it is or whatnot, things are becoming more expensive every single day. Without getting really much of a pay raise in a lot of people's jobs and daily, that's the main complaint. And it's fair enough to see because the cost is rising for most of us, whether it's with rent, food, gas, whatever you want to go with. The cost is going up, and having more cameras come out is great, but at the same time, with how much they're costing versus how much updates they could be doing just with a firmware update, sometimes just feels like it's not the most ideal. Some of the stuff with even the Sony a7 IV that is great, I mean, they could just honestly probably do some sort of firmware update to give you more things, like just update to give you the 1080p 120 frames per second with 10-bit, not through S&Q, so you have a better size quality file. I don't get why they just don't do it. I mean, obviously, fair enough. I'm not an engineer or an expert in the aspects of what they put in the camera to see how it's limited, but sometimes I feel like it's a little bit more of they just know that you won't really say much about it. A little bit like Apple. And I still use Apple. It's just the most convenient for my workflow, but I still kind of have a gripe with it because at the end of the day, Apple, for example, will say, oh, we're not sending you a charger because it's gonna be better for the environment. But in reality, it's just to save them billions of dollars. Now, is that the same thing with Sony? Are they trying to do, not enough firmware updates so that you have to upgrade to the next one, kind of like Apple does? Because despite Apple giving you updates on a lot of like their older phones, they still bring you into that aspect of having to do the never-ending cycle of upgrade a phone, when in reality you don't need to be upgrading all the time. Most of the time their phones could just be updated and you'd be fine. The same thing with a lot of the minor details with the Sony cameras. So for me, is it really an issue that the firmware update wouldn't fix anything, or is it really just them not choosing to do it because it might hinder their next camera release? And that's something that I think is like the downside of Sony, is just when a company gets very powerful and fast, growth and gets really good audience and just users, they tend to become more and more selfish. And I'm hoping that's not the case because, at the end of the day, they do have the third-party lens system, which Canon doesn't really provide. And look how Canon is doing. I can honestly tell you, I know such little amount of people that shoot Canon for that purpose. You might see the ambassadors use it and have like the Peter McKinnon and stuff, but even his friends, most of them tend to switch for Sony or whatever else out there, even Lumix. So when selfishness comes in front of the consumer just to make a pretty little dollar and really you're doing it to screw over your audience, I think that's when business hinders. Don't get me wrong, it's a business. They're going to want to make money. But when your sole focus is only money rather than, building the brand community that will eventually still give you the money that you're looking for, maybe instead of making $5 billion in profit, you might make 4.5. It's still profit and a lot of money. So that's kind of my rant and thought process when it comes down to it, because I have noticed that even with like the new Lumix cameras, everybody's like, well, the firmware update will give you all this stuff. And they've done that for their older cameras, and like they do it to give the audience and the consumer the most fullest potential when it comes down to their camera, because they spent a lot of money on it and they want the consumer to be happy regardless if they're buying a body every 2 years. Realistically, these cameras should last you at least 3 to 5. Depending on what you're shooting, obviously could last you even longer, because most of these cameras for photo haven't really evolved in the aspect of quality. It's just more the autofocus. Video wise, it's a different world because the video keeps evolving a lot more and more with having more specced out kind of cameras where you have the 10-bit color. But as long as you have 4K with 10-bit color, I think you'll be fine for quite a long while, because I haven't really seen much of any TVs that really are promoted for 6K or 8K that it really matters to shoot 6K or 8K. The only reason it'd be nice is to downsize your footage so that it looks nicer, or you can crop in when needed to add some motion and everything. But other than that, 4K is where it's at for the long, kind of period of time for now, which is perfectly fine for future-proofing yourself. So I'm hoping that Sony will do more firmware updates in the future to just kind of get more stuff going for the cameras and use them to our fullest potential, since we're spending a pretty dollar. And it doesn't matter if it's just Sony. I'm talking about any camera out there that just doesn't want to provide so many firmware updates on a fairly regular basis. Doesn't have to be every month, but do it the Apple way, where they kind of bring out a firmware update to fix whatever bugs and complaints, or make the essentially the electronics work a lot better and more cohesive. That's just something that I thought was something that I wanted to discuss with you guys and to see what your thought process is, because have you noticed that there's not really any firmware updates on Sony cameras that often when there could be? So I don't know. That's might be just me noticing that right now, and I could be alone with that thought, but I'm curious to know if you've noticed anything like that with the camera brand that you shoot. Is there a lot of firmware updates, and are they even relevant, or is there nothing going on and you kind of wish there were? Let me know down below, and I would love to hear your thoughts and discuss with you further on that aspect. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.